Howdy, everybody. Shasta College Humanities 2. As we trips our way through the arts and culture of our beloved humanities from the Renaissance to current times. And here we are, current times. Well, the last bit is going to be in cinema. Jean-Luc Godard, the new wave French director, famously said, "Everything is cinema." And when he said that in about 1961, people thought he was crazy. Think about it now, folks. We're all Instagramming, TikToking, YouTubing everything we do, no matter how ridiculous and silly and boring it is. That's cinema, folks. He's still making films at 90. Film is a collective art form that is as powerful as any art form we've ever created as a whole society of people, and it needs a collective to make it survive. It is a collective, meaning it takes a lot of people to make a movie. Although you could do it right now by yourself with this, no problem. Um, but it also takes an audience. And if you look at my recent postings, I've asked you to discuss what your relationship is with films, movies. Do you go to movie theaters? Or do you watch everything on this? Tell me how you like it. Tell us why. I also posted the other day that the journals, you can hand in the journals right now. I don't care. We don't need to do this last bit, but the journals should be up to date to wherever the last day you paid attention. If there's a bunch of blanks and bunch of missed weeks, you will lose points on it. But you can hand it in between now until next week. So it's open. I'm going to assign one more assignment, a quiz. Aren't you lucky? You love quizzes, don't you? I know you do. And the quiz is going to be based on a documentary that I posted in modules and on Canvas. It's called Easy Rider Raging Bulls. It's essentially a set of movies that were made in Hollywood. These are all Hollywood movies from essentially 1968, folks, long time ago, to 1980. Easy Rider, Raging Bulls. Those are two movies. Maybe you've never heard of them. Maybe you need to watch them. They called it the last golden era of cinema. Now, you might think, are we in a golden era right now? No, it's different. The golden era means content. And now we're in the superhero era and big money, big box office, and sequel era. It's not the golden era. That movie, that documentary is based on a great book called Easy Rider Raging Bulls. This isn't my opinion, folks. This is out there. I'm not just some old friggin' guy who loves his old movies. I like new movies too, but they got to be more challenging than X-Men or Iron Man. I need more. And that's really provided by the independents now or foreign directors like Pedro Almodovar from Spain, um, and so many more. My favorite films of all time were Americans up until I got older. Then I loved foreign films by Ingmar Bergman and Fellini, the classics, Akira Kurosawa. I can't go into all this in this brief history we're doing, but I'm going to try my best. Do you like foreign films? If you ever watched a foreign film and you don't like reading subtitles, well, that's weird because you like to text. Certainly, you can read some subtitles because you're missing out on about half of the most brilliant films in the world have subtitles. Ingmar Bergman from Sweden made probably 10 or 12 of the greatest films of all time, subtitled in Swedish. You can follow it. Federico Fellini from Italy was all subtitled. Kurosawa was all subtitled, Japanese filmmaker who was a revolution. He was making films when we were dropping the atom bomb on Japan. That's how powerful the need to tell a story is with a camera. It's our collective art form. When I say our, I mean it takes an audience. My door just opened. I know you think that's creepy. It isn't. It is a wind blowing through here. Anyway, where was I? I got my door open and it's windy. As you all know, it's been very windy lately. Anyway, hope you guys are staying warm. It's weird. Some days it's hot, some days it's cold, some days it's snowing. Huh, hard to keep up on this climate change, folks. Anyway, where am I? Cinema is our powerful storyteller. It what connects us to all each other. We see something up there that we relate to. We see other human beings interacting with each other, reading from a script that hopefully you can relate to of some sort, or get some amusement or creativity out of watching. Um, and cinema has changed so much since early days of cinema. I showed you that documentary a couple days ago. We went from hand cranked cameras, the silent era, to the digital age, and within 100 years, where we're going to go from here, I don't know. Nobody does. But the need to tell a story is always going. It's there because we have a need to tell our stories, and we have a need to see our stories on the screen, a screen, computer screen, smartphone screen, some screen. We need to see our stories. Why do you think TikTok is so popular? I'm not sure what story they're telling besides people on skateboards crashing into walls, cute girls jumping around, lip syncing to their songs. I'm not sure what story we're telling, but that's where we are in the world. Maybe you make TikTok videos. I'm not putting it down. I'm just saying it's a different world. What is the meaning behind it? Do you know? Can you define what the meaning is? Okay, what I talk about in this class all the time is the culture that this art is being created in. I've talked about Shakespeare, what was going on in his day, Picasso, what's going on in his day, Andy Warhol, what's going on in his day. And that's the key to this class. And so I'm going to ask this questions on this quiz. What was going on in the culture? And I'm not going to give you I'm not going to do the questions yet. I'm going to post those in about 2 days. So get prepared. You're going to have about 4 days to do the quiz. It's worth 15 points. There's 3 parts, each worth 5 points. They're essay questions, and you get to take them home, folks. But you got to watch that documentary. If you don't watch the documentary from beginning to end, you will not get these questions. And I can always tell when people don't finish the documentary. They try to fake that ending. They try to fake like they've seen it by Googling it, by Wikipediaing the story, and it doesn't work. That's not what I'm looking for. I want you guys to critically put your eyes on that documentary and use your critical thinking on what was going on in the culture at the time those movies were being made and why that's important or not important. But it was important, folks. Lots of stuff. As we get closer to the quiz, I will give you more hints because I want you to do good on it. It pains me when nobody does good on this quiz because I know they weren't paying attention. Pay attention. It's in color, folks. You won't know these movies unless you were around in those days, but those days were the days where people like Martin Scorsese, Francis Ford Coppola, Terrence Malick, and the rest were making the best cinema that we've seen in Hollywood, coming out of Hollywood, folks, in the last 50 years. Yes, better than X-Men. Sorry, folks. Because the stories are richer and they're reflecting on who we are. I don't know if X-Men what it reflects on. Yes, we want to have a suit and fly around and beat superheroes. I get it. Anyway, I'm talking about I teach a film class. I'm talking about superheroes now. Do they matter? Why do they matter? Why do we are they ridiculous? Is it cartoon? Is it comic book? It's all that. That's where we are with culture, but I don't want to talk about that right now. Right now, the other day, when I I'm trying to give you a brief history of film. I think I went up through the Roaring Twenties. Women got the vote. They start cutting their hair. They start partying with the men. Booze was illegal, and it was called the Roaring Twenties. And the women who dressed up in fun outfits were called flappers. They were having the best time of their lives. They weren't strictly um, staying at home minding the children. They were out having a good time with the men. This is the first time that ever happened. Women had the right to vote. We came out of World War One, and people were feeling pretty positive. And then, and Prohibition hit. That means there was enough religious people in the world who didn't like anybody to have fun and drink, and so they they outlawed liquor for a good 10 years. But the party didn't stop. It's hard to stop the party, especially when someone tries to censor the party. And in those party years, Hollywood really thrived with great comedies by Charlie Chaplin, Harold Lloyd, Buster Keaton, and then great dramas and swashbuckling pirate movies with Douglas Fairbanks Sr. and uh, Mary Pickford and Gloria Swanson, a lot of great actors. John Ford, a great director who directed movies up to the 1970s, directed early cinema, silent era cinema. Maybe you know him from John Wayne movies. He directed 20 John Wayne movies, from starting with Stagecoach to The Searchers to Ford Apache to She Wore a Yellow Ribbon. He essentially made John Wayne a star, if you like that sort of thing. And John Ford told an American story, usually through the Western landscape. Um, that was his forte, although he made other movies too. But okay, so jumping ahead of myself. So we're coming out of the 20s now, and in that era, gangsters became a big deal because illegal trade in booze was a big deal. And so all of a sudden, for the first time in this country, we had gangsterism in Chicago, New York, big cities usually. And because illegal booze was a huge industry. And the FBI went after these people. J. Edgar Hoover was our new director, and he was bound and determined to stop all these booze runners. Well, there's a lot of violence out there in the world, and there was these kind of famous gangsters like Al Capone and Bonnie and Clyde, who were really punk gangsters. They weren't nothing to do with. They were just on psychotic killers on a killing spree, and then but people like John Dillinger. These were major gangsters who were willing to go against the system and die by the system because the system killed them. Um, so booze was a huge thing. So Hollywood, what do? They reflect what's going on in the culture by making gangster films like Little Caesar, Scarface, The Roaring Twenties, and people like Edward G. Robinson and James Cagney became stars in this era on these gangsters films. Public Enemy is a great 1930s film about the rise and fall of the gangster. It all ends bad for them, folks. Hollywood always kills off the bad guy. That was one of the things that they did. You didn't get away with your crimes because they're going to teach you an object lesson. And so the 30s, booze became legal again, but in 1929 there was a market crash, and the depression was on big time. For the next 10 years, people are struggling to pay rent, uh, to have a job, to feed their kids. So how does Hollywood keep going? What's their modus operandi to keep moving? Hollywood is really good at knowing how to make money. Look at what they're doing now. Let's make another sequel to Iron Man, to X-Men. And people will go see it because they've seen all the other ones that are curious about the next one, even though it's a letdown, usually, because they're not doing an original. They're just kind of doing the same story that you've seen before. Some people find comfort in that. Other people, and I'm one of them, find that distracting. I want to see new stories. I don't want to see the same story regurgitated over and over and over again. And there's a million ways to tell a story out there. Uh, if you're original enough and creative enough, you could do it. So, in the 1930s, prohibition is over. You can actually drink, you can actually go to nightclubs, but nobody has any money to have any fun and because of the depression. And this is all across the United States. Um, but how? So, what does Hollywood do? They try to make films that make people feel better about their lives. People wanted to see these gangster films because they wanted to see that romance of that lifestyle, thinking it's romantic. They all ended up dead by violence, and that gave them an outlet. There was other films that popped up during that era. Musicals, for one, happy musicals with Fred Astaire mostly, and his dancing partners, which were varied, Ginger Rogers and others. And they were happy musicals, usually set in high society. Well, nobody lived in high society, but people like to go see that life, that glamorous lifestyle on the big screen. And so that's what they did. They went to those movies, they put down a nickel or a dime. That's expensive in those days. Hollywood knew how to get their money. So they might not even get the can of soup for their kid that day. They might go to a movie. But when they're in the movie for those 2 hours, they could forget about the troubles. They could forget about the state of the world, the depression. We're not in a war, but in Europe, Hitler is starting to percolate. He's starting to come into power in the early 30s. And we saw the writing on the wall, but it took 10 years for him to arrive in full force. But he's not there yet. In the meantime, we're making happy musicals, usually set in high society, in a world that most people didn't live in, still don't live in. Um, Fantasy, fairy tales, escape. Also, another popular form of movies in those days was horror films, usually monster films, not horror films like Halloween and Nightmare on Elm Street. That's different. That's psychological horror that comes in later in the 70s. I'll talk about that later. This was monster films, usually Dracula, Frankenstein, The Mummy, Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde, Bride of Frankenstein. Why were these movies so popular? A lot of them were based on books. Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein. Bram Stoker wrote Dracula, and so they were people had read these books, and they were cheap to do. They usually didn't star A actors. They starred kind of unknown actors who needed the job, and they had heavy makeup on, so you couldn't see them anyway. But they became stars in their own right, and people loved these movies because at the time when Hitler was coming to power in Europe, he's a monster, right? That's the monster, Hitler, folks. But we don't know how to fight that monster. But we could fight Frankenstein's monster. We could fight Dracula with a stake. We could fight the mummy. We could fight the werewolf with a silver bullet. We were incapable of knowing how to dealing with the rise of Nazism and fascism in Europe. That was sweeping Europe and Italy. So, and that came about, a lot of that came about through comic books. Comic books were popular in the 30s, and the first action comic book that had Superman, let's say Superman on it. What was Superman doing in those first comics? By the way, if you have an action comic from those days, it's worth $1 million. So hang on to it, okay? Um, Superman was fighting Nazis. That's right. Because Superman could fight the Nazis. We couldn't. We didn't want to get involved in another war. We hoped that was just going to go away. It was going to be over there, not here. That all changed later with Pearl Harbor. The war came home. Wonder Woman, the early Wonder Womans, if you have one of those, same thing. It's valuable, folks. She was fighting Nazism and fascism. And that became a popular thing. We could beat Dracula in the movies. We couldn't beat the real villain who was percolating in Europe and about to sweep into a world war. So that's why those movies became rather popular. They didn't have very many social realistic movies in those days because nobody wanted to see the pain and misery they were in. Then they had these things that we would call them rom-coms now, romantic comedies, they call them. I don't like that term, but that's the way they call it. Sandra Bullock and Reese Witherspoon, they got the market corner in those things. Well, early on, they called them screwball comedies. Another popular 30s Depression era art form, starting with It Happened One Night, Frank Capra's great, great film. And it usually involved high society types, and we were laughing at them because they look foolish. And people like to go into the movie theater and laugh at those foolish rich people. I think we still do. Um, I like laughing at rich people because they're silly, or they can be. Anyway, that was hugely popular, screwball comedies. And people like Carol Lombard, who was a, and Clark Gable, Henry Fonda, James Stewart, Katharine Hepburn, all got their start on these screwball comedies, and they're hugely popular. Bringing a Baby, Philadelphia Story, My Man Goffrey are really quite exquisite works of social art. They're commenting on how silly these high society types are who maybe didn't earn their money. Maybe they got their money through inheritance, or their dad was a Robert King, what they call, industrial type of guy who's out of touch with the people. And those movies were hugely popular because in the movie, those high society types usually got their comeuppance. And the audience enjoyed that, seeing these high society types being brought down. Because why should they have such a great life when I have such a crappy life? So those are the three or four genres, along with westerns. And the westerns in those days are very black and white. They're very melodramatic, meaning it was always a bad guy and a good guy. That was it. That all changed in 1939. We're coming out of the Depression now. Franklin Roosevelt is our president, and he is come up with this thing called they call it the New Deal. He's going to put America back to work. We started building buildings, bridges, highways. We started building the freeway system across the United States of America. So he's putting people back to work. That incentivized Hollywood to start making more expensive movies, more broad movies, more not escapism movies. And it's somebody like John Ford, who was a director who had already won the Academy Award for The Informer and directed a bunch of silent films, did a masterpiece Western called Stagecoach. It's changed the landscape and how we look at Westerns. Stagecoach was made John Wayne a star. He had been around for quite a while, but he was a minor actor in these minor, what they call serials. And that was an adult Western. It's about a group of rejected loser type people in a stagecoach going across hostile Indian country. So there's hints of racism in that film also. Uh, on the bus, not a bus, but the stagecoach is a ragtag group of people who are trying to change their lives, and they're being kicked out of the town. One's a prostitute. She's being asked to leave because if she's a naughty lady. There's another one who's a drunken doctor. He's leaving because he's botched too many surgeries drunk. There's a corrupt banker who's stealing a bunch of money. He's leaving. There's the gambler, and then there's the gunfighter who's John Wayne. And then there's uh, the good school marm teacher who's pregnant. So there's all these types, each of them representing types out in America. They're going across the country on a stagecoach. And are they going to live? Are they going to survive? What happens? And that tells the story. In the story, John Wayne, who's a good guy, he's the Ringo. He's a Ringo kid, so he has got a reputation. He's out for revenge. His family, his brother's been killed, and he's out to get the guys who did it. He meets the woman who was a prostitute, but he doesn't know that. But she's got a heart of gold, folks. She's a good listener. Falls in love with her, and now they're on their way to this town and they're trying to stop him from seeking revenge. That doesn't stop him. But what we're seeing in that story, that movie, that groundbreaking movie, is adult content. It just wasn't good against evil. It was shades of gray. It's like all there's the pregnant lady, the prostitute, the traveling salesman who sells liquor to the Indians, by the way. So there's all this gray area of storytelling and character development, and that hadn't been seen before. And to tell you how prolific John Ford was in 1939, he did Stagecoach, he did Young Mr. Lincoln, which was starred Henry Fonda. It was a story about Abraham Lincoln before he became president when he was a lawyer. And he did Dreams Along the Mohawk with Claudia Colbert and Henry Fonda about the settling of the Mohawk Valley in New York during the Revolutionary War. Three historical movies, huge cast of thousands, movies in 3 years. How'd they do that? Well, because they had a studio system that was ran like clockwork. This studio building here, they're making the costumes here for the movie that they're going to shoot in 2 months while he's shooting another movie on this sound stage over here. And they're preparing his third movie on another sound stage. They're casting, they're making the costumes. And so he goes from one movie to the next. Nowadays, it takes 3 to 5 years to get a movie made. And you have to go out, find producers, write a script, get blah, blah, blah. This is independent Hollywood, but it's also kind of standard what's going on in Hollywood right now. Look at the credits on movies right now. They're crazy long. They'll have 10 producers, 10 writers. There's a lot of people in movies. There's too many hands, too many cooks. And I think that's kind of dumbed down our films. It's not made them as rich, artistically rich. During the era of films, there were directors had a visual stamp on their work. People like Alfred Hitchcock, John Ford. You didn't even have to see the credits to know it was John Ford film. You could tell by the content, camera work. Alfred Hitchcock was the same way. Howard Hawks was the same way. There's famous directors from the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s. And then along comes in 1939. It was a bumper crop year. We're coming out of the Depression. And in that year alone, there was 30, 40 the finest films Hollywood's ever produced. Just to name a couple, Gone with the Wind, all in color, by the way. Wizard of Oz, Stagecoach, Wuthering Heights, all in 1 year. Hollywood was busting at the seams to tell these great stories. And they finally had the money to do so. And of course, that raised the rate of ticket price and the desire to tell more complicated, elaborate stories with elaborate visuals. I mean, Gone with the Wind was the Star Wars of its day. It was that big and popular and made money like they never made before. 1939 was a bumper crop in Hollywood. In other parts of the country, filmmaking is not as, they don't have the money we do in England or Italy. Yes, they're making films, but fascism is starting to come across Europe. And so production is being shut down. 1937, 8, 9, England is getting bombed by so their productions are shutting down by Germany. They're asking for our help, but Congress doesn't want to go to war. We already gone through World War One, don't want to go through another one. So, um, I'm thinking I can't cram all this in one night. I'm trying to. I'm talking too fast, and probably a lot of it's not making sense to you. I'm going to shut it down right here. World War II. We're going to stop right there, and I'm going to pick it up. What is today? It's Tuesday. I'm going to pick it up the next day, which would be Thursday. Then that's when I assign the quiz also. So today we went to 1940. That's where we're going to stop. Right before World War II, WW2. Remember what I'm telling you about what's going on in the culture that's making this artwork thrive. So I'll see you guys on Thursday. Start watching that documentary. Take notes. Easy Rider, Raging Bulls. It's about 1960s filmmaking. That's what the quiz is going to be based on. I'll talk to you soon when the story of film continues.